All right. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for our colloquium with Dr. Evan Kleiman. I'm very excited to introduce him. Before we begin, however, I would like to first acknowledge that the UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, their history, traditions from one generation to the next on this site. And we thank the Musqueam Nation for its hospitality and support of our work. You may be joining us today from many places, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I was encouraged to add a personal element to the land acknowledgement, and I think that's a great idea. Every time I had an idea about how to draw upon my background, experiences, or learning, it felt like it would be prioritizing or centering my own perspective, which in the end did not feel right. So I will simply say that I have more to learn. I'm grateful to be part of a culture that prioritizes land acknowledgements, prioritizes days devoted to national truth and reconciliation, prioritizes other opportunities for learning, thoughtfulness, and continual progress and reconciliation. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Evan Kleiman. Dr. Kleiman is assistant professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Psychology since 2019. Before then, he did 4 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard in the Department of Psychology with Dr. Matthew Knock. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from George Mason in 2014, and before that, received his bachelor's from Temple with high honors. Now, his measurables are not the reason that I'm excited to have him, but I am going to note that he does not look like a third-year assistant professor. He has been the PI of numerous grants totaling, I think, upwards of $6 million. He has more than 100 publications in top journals. More than 20 of these have over 100 citations. So this is someone who is, he's new, but somehow he has been around forever, and his impact is deep and broad. Now, the substance for me is why I'm so excited to have Dr. Kleiman here. Usually when we're given the opportunity to think about who we want to bring in for speakers, we tend to start with senior people. And when I was thinking about that in relation to my field and whose ideas, whose methods are most improving the field's knowledge, Dr. Kleiman for me was the name that came to mind. There are so many researchers who will chase the latest fad, the latest technological or methodological or statistical innovation, and use it to essentially generate grants or publications. But Dr. Kleiman stands out to me as someone who is genuinely motivated by a desire to understand something better and to make a difference. And I think we have a, there we go, we do the microphone. And is very thoughtful and intelligent and pioneering in this regard. In this case, the something of interest is suicide. And while understanding suicide has undeniable practical importance, it also has undeniable theoretical importance. On the surface, everything about suicide seems to go against human nature. We as humans spend tremendous effort avoiding pain, avoiding injury, avoiding death. Yet a subset of people, a subset of the time, have a desire for death and take action to die. And suicide is not rare. It is a top 10 leading cause of death, more or less, wherever you look around the world. In North America, it's the second most common cause of death among both young adults and adolescents. And yet, for some reason, we don't hear about it a lot compared to other kinds of public health problems, like drunk driving, like addictions, like pediatric cancer, and so many others. Maybe the topic feels scary, maybe it feels too impenetrable for common discourse, but I would argue that we do not understand human nature if we don't understand suicide. And so we can't understand human nature if our fear or confusion does not allow us to study suicide and discuss it in a manner that is thoughtful, careful, and straightforward. I would suggest that Dr. Kleiman is among the very best at taking this kind of approach. He produces some of the best foundational data on the nature of suicidal desire over time and those who experience it. He also leverages technology in ways that are thoughtful, careful, and strategic. His work spans from the basic and descriptive to the applied and to the cutting edge. His most recent work on leveraging EMA, ecological momentary assessment, and also ecological momentary intervention to understand and prevent suicide is cutting edge, and he is a leader and possibly the leader in this area. And finally, I'll note that he's also a superb colleague. He doesn't just produce important and useful work, but produces and shares tools that helps others. He publishes articles devoted to helping others conduct their own EMA work in challenging settings and populations. He goes out of his way to post tools to help others on his website, things like power curve computational algorithms and payment calculators to empower others to do EMA work. In short, I find Dr. Kleiman to be the ideal academic, superb researcher and thinker, valued collaborator, helpful and kind colleague. And so while I apologize for my long introduction, I wanted to do him justice. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kleiman.
Thank you so much for that incredibly generous and kind, amazing introduction. Let me know, check, cash, however you want. I'm happy to pay. But no, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, and I am really excited to be here. And especially as your first colloquium of the year, hopefully I'll set us off to a good start here. And so, thank you again for having me. And what I'm going to talk about today is primarily about the work I've done in suicide, but as you'll hopefully see, a lot of the research that I've done, especially the methods that I've used, probably transcends a lot of different areas of both clinical psychology and psychology in general. And so I'm looking forward to the questions that people have, and kind of, the interdisciplinary nature of a lot of the work that psychology has done will kind of be reflected here when speaking to an entire department. And so I usually begin talks, as most suicide researchers do, by talking about the suicide rate. But as Dr. Kleman has so clearly laid out, and as we all know, suicide is a big problem. So I'm going to skip those numbers and instead start with a slightly more optimistic, fun number to start with. And that number is global smartphone ownership. And so in 2011, 1.3 out of 10 adults in the entire world owned a smartphone. 10 years later, 8.4 out of 10 adults in the world own a smartphone. And so, of course, smartphone technology, mobile technology is still inaccessible for some. We are nowhere near having every single person who wants access to this technology having it. But certainly in just 10 years, we've made amazing strides. The world has made amazing strides in getting access to technology to a wide variety of people. This has been unprecedented, and as a result, naturally, this increased availability of technology, especially smartphones, has led to this increased interest in infusing the technology across research. This is certainly true of psychology and psychiatry, and I'm sure many other fields, but it's been really notable within the work that I do in the field of suicide. There's really been this incredible increased interest in using smartphone technology. So given that, today I'm going to talk about the role of technology, smartphones and wearables, in suicide research and prevention. And so what I want to do is talk a bit about three questions. The first one is, how does technology help us better understand the everyday lives of people at suicide risk? I'm going to spend the majority of my time there talking about better characterizing and just understanding this phenomenon we have been studying for so incredibly long. Then we'll talk about how technology helps us better predict suicide risk. And I'll talk about another arm of research using technology to make the content that we use in psychotherapeutic interventions more accessible for those who need it. Let me tell you, though, what I'm not going to tell you today. So I am not going to tell you that technology, smartphones, AI, machine learning, whatever, is a magic wand for reducing the suicide rate. There is no technology that we have, probably will have in the future, that its mere existence and mere utilization in research will make us somehow understand every single thing we need to know about suicide. On the other hand, I'm not also going to say that technology has no chance of ever improving our chances at reducing the suicide rate. And so my goal here is to give you a balanced perspective on technology's role in suicide prediction and prevention. So I'm here to neither tell you that technology is our cure-all, nor tell you that technology is a total waste and we should just go back to paper and pencil studies. So why should you trust me? I have had a lot of amazing collaborators. So if what I say is not to your liking, you can blame them. It's their fault. They've done all of it. And if you like it, thank you. And I've been very fortunate to have been funded continuously for nearly a decade using smartphones and wearable devices. And what I'll say to that is that it's this interesting thing, that the thing that I'm interested in happened to also align well with funding priorities. And for students, in the room here that are kind of hearing this, this is sometimes something that just happens, right? where, it is a perfect world where the things you want to study happen to be in line with funding priorities. But what I'll say to this is that your topic, your area may be really important, and funding agencies may have just not recognized that yet. And so I would firmly encourage all of you to not be discouraged by a discrepancy between your research ideas and the request for funding proposals from research institutions, because sometimes you have really good ideas and funders are just slow to recognize it. So let's go to the first question here. How does technology help us better understand the lives of people at risk for suicide? And so I'm going to talk a lot about a set of studies that use EMA, or ecological momentary assessment. This technology goes by like 15 different names: experience sampling, intensive longitudinal monitoring, real-time monitoring, and a bunch of other things. They're all kind of referring to the same thing. Effectively, they involve repeated assessment of things like affect, in case of the studies I do, suicidal thinking, in the present moment, repeatedly throughout the day. And so what that does is it lets us get a glimpse of what's going on in people's everyday lives as these phenomena are occurring. And back in the day, like 15, 20 years ago, EMA was done with things like beepers. I recognize some of you may not know what a beeper is. I will avoid that existential crisis for the moment. Or Palm Pilots, which were digital devices that really didn't have phone capabilities. And even before that, of course, was paper and pencil. These devices were useful, but of course, they were problematic in the sense that people didn't always carry them with them during the day. And so it wasn't until now, where we have smartphone-based ecological momentary assessment, that lets us ask people questions on a device that 81% of people have with them at any given time. And this is really important, because then we are not limiting our studies just to the people who are willing to carry an extra device, or just the people who are open to technology, but we have a much wider range of people that we can access and find out about what's going on in their everyday lives. So what I want to show you here, this is sort of the first EMA suicide finding that we had. It was about 5 years ago now. And so, at this point now, these findings are becoming quite dated, which I'm really excited about, because it means people have built on them. But what I'm showing you here is a really basic finding. So what we did was we asked people throughout the day how suicidal they were. And we had a series of questions we used. The specific items aren't necessarily important. Just know that it's a composite of items representing the desire to die by suicide, how intense one's desire is to die by suicide, and how strongly someone resists that urge to die by suicide. So here you see these little facet plots. The y-axis is how severe someone's suicidal thinking is. The x-axis is each individual survey prompt. So we just asked people throughout the day, among other things, how suicidal they were. Each rectangle is an individual person. And this is a group of people that attempted suicide at least once in the past year. We see similar things across a bunch of different studies. What we see, as you look at these lines, and they look squiggly and probably kind of confusing, is that they're messy. And what this tells us is that suicidal thinking is not something that is a static, continuous state, but rather it's something that changes quite quickly. In fact, there's only about 4 to 8 hours between each response in this study. About a third of them differed by a standard deviation from the prior response. So what this means is that over just a few hours, right? 4 hours is not a long time. Participants were reporting a qualitatively different suicide risk state than they were prior, right? So that's really important. There's another thing here that's also really interesting methodologically. So if you look at the red line is each participant's average score over the duration of these 40 or so survey prompts. If you look at that average, there is almost no one in this study whose responses were so close to the average that had we just asked someone once, how severe has your suicidal thinking been over the past month? The answer they would have given would have approximated the picture of what was going on. And the reason this is important is because historically, myself included, a lot of the work that we've done in suicide risk and suicidal thinking has been asking people to reflect over a long period of time, over a month, over a year, or even over their lifetime. Now that information is really important. It gives us a sense of, on average, what things have been like. But when we use EMA, it lets us learn about the nuances of what happens over just a few hours. So again, it's not to say this prior research isn't useful. It certainly is. We've learned a lot, and we will continue to learn a lot about suicide risk not using EMA. But what EMA tells us that we can't really get from other methods outside of something like timeline follow back is we can't really assess how much someone's suicidal thinking varies over a short period of time. And so this was interesting. And one thing that we did from that, right? So, okay, we see suicidal thinking varies. That's interesting in some ways. In other ways, if you've ever treated someone who's suicidal or if you've ever been suicidal yourself, you know this. Suicidal thinking varies like many affect states. And so we went a step further and did what I bet some of you were doing, and I know I did when I first looked at the figures, was try to group the squiggly lines into similar sets of squiggly lines. And so what question we had was, can we do this? Can we look at someone's report of suicidal thinking over the day and see if we can create these meaningful subgroups of individuals based on their responses? And so that's what we did. We realized there was a computerized version of doing this. I will say that when we first had these findings, I literally printed all this out. There was like a ton of wasted ink on my office floor, and then finally on Matt's office floor. There was a lot of wasted paper in which we tried to like figure these things out, and we realized we should probably be more sophisticated. And we did a latent profile analysis. Although to be clear, it's actually not even that sophisticated. Latent profile analysis is somewhat straightforward, where we wanted to see if we inputted sort of descriptors of this line. So for example, people's average score, how much they varied from point to point. So the RMSSD, basically how jagged the line is, how many non-zero responses they gave, things like that to sort of describe this line. Could we classify people in different groups? So that was our first question. The second question was, okay, if we can classify people into certain groups, which we certainly would be able to, that's how latent profile analysis works, you always get groups. Do these different profiles differ in an important, meaningful way? So not just can we classify people, but when we classify them, are there certain groups or profiles that stick out in a way that's really meaningful? And so what we found here, and so you're looking at one sample, we've replicated this in another sample. Other research teams have basically found the same thing or something similar, which is really exciting. And we found these 5 profiles. The important thing to extract from these profiles is that they differ in 2 key ways. They differ in the average level of suicidal thinking and how much their suicidal thinking varied around that average. So we have some people, like in the bottom orange boxes here, that had a high level of suicidal thinking, but varied quite a bit around it during the day. We look at the red box, we had people who also had a high average level of suicidal thinking, but they kind of stayed there. They didn't move around that much. And so what that told us is that, okay, maybe there's this important group here. And so we looked to see if they differed in a variety of factors, one of which they differed on is recency of a prior attempt. So people who had more recently attempted suicide had a higher average level of suicidal thinking and less variability around it. Now, that's interesting, but kind of brings more questions than answers. In fact, what it made us think is perhaps this tells us something about suicide risk in the future. That after someone attempts suicide, does their suicidal thinking stay high? And perhaps as they get farther away from the attempt, does it become more variable? And perhaps for those who don't have more variable ideation, are they at higher risk for a suicide attempt in the future? So we had a lot of questions. One of the things that we're doing now is conducting a series of follow-up studies to replicate this and extend it. And so what we want to find out is just that, okay, we know this high-risk group of people, they're different from other people that might look similar, they've all attempted suicide. And what happens to those people over the future? Are they more likely to attempt suicide at a later date? Or is this just some other phenomenological thing that we're finding? So to recap the work on understanding and describing suicidal thinking using smartphones, what does this tell us? Well, the first thing it tells us is that suicidal thinking can escalate very quickly and de-escalate just as quickly. So over a 4 to 8 hour period, suicidal thinking can raise really quickly and go down just as quickly. This is important to know because it tells us clinically it's important to monitor high-risk patients frequently. Someone could say right now, I am not suicidal, and they could mean it. Things change, Who knows what those things are? Right? That's sort of our challenge, figuring out what happens in the interim. 4, 5, 6 hours later, these same individuals could be acutely suicidal. And they could also mean it too. So it tells us a lot about why we should frequently monitor people that may be at high risk for suicide. Of course, easier said than done. What does high risk mean? What happens to put these people at high risk are incredibly large open questions. What it also tells us, and this is sort of a scary kind of thing I'm going to come back to throughout the talk, is that if we're really trying to predict imminent suicide risk, like something that happens right before a suicide attempt, our window of time might be really small. We may only have a few hours to really intervene in imminent suicide risk. And so this finding drives a lot of the intervention work that we do. Okay, so that was smartphones and understanding. Now I want to talk a bit about better predicting suicide risk. And I'll give a bit of a disclaimer. This is the section where I'm probably going to be the most pessimistic. And so I'm going to talk here about trying to predict risk into the future. That's really hard to do. We're not great at it. I'm going to talk about using things like wearables and machine learning. And those are some of the coolest things that have a lot of promise, but not quite yet. So I'll give you that disclaimer and then a bunch of others. So smartphones, the availability and access to smartphones has been increasing like exponentially, right, over the past decade. We know this, both by the figures I gave you and just sort of like what you know around you. There's a similar increase in wearable technology, kind of across both consumer and in scientific realms. And with that increase in interest and availability of the technology, there's been an increase in suicide research of trying to use that technology to tell us when people are becoming suicidal. The reason for this makes sense, right? If we only have a small window of time to tell when someone's suicidal, and that time is really acutely distressing for someone, it would be great if we could like passively know when someone is in distress. And so this increase has been incredible. So, you know, if you look, this is this like steep linear increase every year of more and more papers on wearables and suicide. So people are interested. There's a lot of review papers, not a lot of science. And so why is this good, right? Because if, and it's a big if, we can get a passive metric of risk without requiring patients, participants to report it, that would be really useful. The reason for this is that the experience of acute suicide risk is so distressing that it's probably pretty difficult to ask someone to do a survey at their most acutely suicidal. A wearable device might be able to do a bit better for that because we're not asking people to actively report on their states. So consumer research grade devices, they're incredibly accessible. Here is just a collection of the ones we have used in our research. That was a cool animation, so I will replay that again for those of you who want to see it. Look at that. I've now gotten my time's worth in putting that together. Excellent. And so a lot of them exist, but here's a couple caveats. First of all, there's likely no physiological signature of suicide risk, right? We're not identifying some magic unicorn that kind of tells us that someone's suicidal. Instead, we're focusing on physiological correlates of relevant risk factors. So things that we believe to be related to suicide risk, things that are going on at the same time someone is considering suicide. We want to see if we can detect those things using a wearable device. And so a lot of what we focus on are autonomic responses to stress, which is a correlate of agitation. We're also doing a lot of work related to sleep. There's a bunch of work relating sleep and suicide together. Sleep is one of those things that we have a decent sense of how to objectively measure. And so the work we're doing using wearables kind of focuses on these two areas. I'll go through in a second some more details on those specific studies. I'm going through that part quickly. So I want to give a bit of cautious optimism here. There's a lot of work left to be done before wearables are ready for use in clinical deployment. So research still needs some work. Clinical deployment needs even more work. Wearable devices are expensive, they're imprecise, and they're sometimes annoying to wear. I say this knowing that my Apple Watch, which I in theory should wear, is currently in front of me because it was uncomfortable. And so if people are not wearing the devices, they're not really going to do much to predict any kind of state. So the question that we have, sort of this initial question, was trying to evaluate how much more these devices tell us above and beyond easier assessment methods like self-report. I put easier in quotation marks because, of course, it's a lot of effort to ask people to report on their affect states 3, 4, 5 times a day. But it's easier and cheaper to use those methods compared to a wearable device. And so this is a relative ease, not an absolute ease. So what I want to jump into here is talking about how a wearable device may or may not add something to EMA data when we're trying to tell if someone will have suicidal thoughts. So kind of the basic setup here is we have an EMA study. We're asking a bunch of affect states that we think correlate with suicidal thinking. And we have participants wearing a wearable device, and we want to see, can we better predict suicidal thinking just a few hours later if we have affect, like negative emotion, positive emotion, or does our model improve? Do we get any more accuracy by adding a wearable device? And so in this study, I'm going to talk about the first study here was 25 adult inpatients. They wore the Empatica Embrace, and they did EMA for their inpatient stay and 28 days afterwards. The Empatica Embrace measures a few things. That kind of the most notable sensor is a skin conductance sensor. Those of you who do physiological research, please don't ask any questions, so I'm not going to be able to answer them now. Those of you who do physiological research are probably aware of the kind of caveats here, but I'll spell them out for those of you who don't. The Embrace measures skin conductance at 4 Hertz. That is not a very fast frequency. If you do laboratory research, you're probably measuring it at 250 or 1,000 Hertz. It measures it from the top of the wrist. Not the best place to measure it, but it's better than the other options because people don't like something on the back of their neck or other spots. And there's a lot of noise going on, right? So we're looking here, and I'll show you in a second, and I'll talk about the other study in a minute. We're looking at autonomic arousal. And so the device that we use has an algorithm, a relatively simple algorithm that tries to identify skin conductance responses. So basically a period of time in which someone is having a physiological response to distress, think fight or flight response, but it could also look like surprise. So we've got some specificity issues. But ultimately here, we're looking at the number of times in a given day, someone is having this fight or flight response, sort of like physiological correlative agitation or distress. And what we wanted to see is if we compare EMA data and EMA data with the knowledge of autonomic events, does that autonomic event, the skin conductance response, does that tell us anything more? Do we get a more accurate prediction? And so what I'm showing you here, I'm going to show you a figure. We looked at 2 different types of affect, so low arousal negative affect and high arousal negative affect, predicting suicidal thinking. Here, we're talking about the presence of suicidal thoughts. So in the next hour, is someone going to have no suicidal thoughts or some non-zero level of suicidal thoughts, right? And on the y-axis here is a performance score. So basically, this is the composite of fit measures. Whenever you compare models, you have AIC, BIC, R squared. You could pick and choose. Sometimes you've got some researcher degree of freedom issues when we pick and choose. This is a composite metric that looks at multiple performance scores and shows any given model. Of that model, how many performance scores is it the best performing? The closer to 100% means better fit on more measures. So something closer to 100 is a better performing model than something farther from 100. So first, what I'm showing you is affect only. So the best performing model for low arousal, right? Affect only, 99.5%. I'll give you a bit of a spoiler, that's going to be hard to beat. High arousal affect was not really a great fitting model. So if we know how sad you are right now, with some accuracy, not great, we can tell whether or not you're going to be suicidal an hour later. And so when we added the wearable device, our performance got worse, right? So more information made our models perform more poorly. Now, the reason for this, right, more data making it harder to predict something is that obviously these are models that are penalized for complexity, as they should be. And so when we add complexity, one predictor, we've added so much noise that our model got worse, right? So the answer to this one, no. Having a wearable device really is not going to tell us much more about whether or not someone's going to have suicidal thoughts an hour from now, based on just asking people. Okay, now, so that is presence. Now we're also looking at severity. So what this is saying is how severe someone's suicidal thinking. So instead of 0, 1, we are looking at 0 through 10, right? So now we're looking at a continuous score. How severe is someone's suicidal thinking? And thankfully, what we found here, a bit of a glimmer of optimism, is that the wearable device does indeed improve our ability to predict severity of suicidal thinking for both low arousal and high arousal emotion, right? Now, what I'll say is that yes, that's good. Tells us something that EMA data become more accurate when we add a wearable when predicting suicidal thoughts, but not necessarily the presence of the thoughts. What I'll say though is that it's not a big increase. So it tells us something, it's somewhat promising, but the addition of a wearable device is far from this magical thing that's unlocking our ability to predict suicidal thinking, right? Okay, so that's the first study. Now I'm going to jump to another study. And so here, our goal was to pack in as many buzzwords as possible. And so this was a study in which we recruited suicidal adolescents from an inpatient unit. This is done in collaboration with Cassie Glenn, who, because the field is incredibly small, was actually one of Dr. Klonsky's first students and is a great person to work with if any of you are ever looking for a collaborator. And so in this study, what we did was we had teams do EMA and wear a Philips Spectrum ActiWatch. It looks like this. I just happen to have it on my desk as evidence of how much this work that we're doing. And this measures sleep and a variety of factors related to sleep. And then we also did EMA. So what we're trying to find is if we take EMA data and we take wearable data and put that together in a machine learning model. So now we have wearables and machine learning and EMA in the same study. There's got to be some word for most buzzwords in a study. I think we got it, right? So we wanted to see which factors best predicted suicidal thinking the next day. And so I'm going to start and tell you these results from bad to worse, or from good to bad. I guess I should be a little more positive. So here are the variables that predicted severity of suicidal thinking the next day. Spending long time, or taking longer to fall back to or fall asleep after going to bed, sleeping less, feeling sad the prior day, having nightmares, and ruminating before sleep. Okay, this is useful. These are interesting things that theoretically we would expect to be associated with suicidal thinking the next day. Here are variables that did not predict severity of suicidal thinking. So the variables here in a lasso regression model just didn't predict suicidal thinking the next day. Here are variables that were associated with suicidal thinking the next day, but in the wrong direction. Now, of course, some of this could be an artifact of the model we used, could be an artifact of having multiple correlated variables and the model just didn't do a great job correcting for it. But ultimately, we've got variables like better reported sleep quality being associated with higher suicide risk. That intuitively doesn't make a ton of sense, right? So we had some variables associated with suicidal thinking, some unassociated, and some associated in the wrong direction. There's one other thing I'll add to this, which gives even more perspective. So what you're seeing here are the source of the data. So the blue variables are from EMA, and the green variables are from a wearable device. So what this tells us effectively is that none of the wearable data told us anything meaningful about how suicidal someone would be the next day. All of the variables that were in the correct direction and significant came from self-report. Now, that doesn't just mean wearables don't work, right? What that might tell us is that this long studied finding that sleep and suicide are related might be kind of complicated, where it may not be literally how well you're sleeping or how much you're sleeping, but rather something about the perception of sleep. So this study does kind of suggest that wearables may not tell us all we need to, but there's another kind of optimistic, interesting thing from this, is that whatever is going on between sleep and suicide might have more to do with perception of sleep than of the objective experience of sleep. And so that is pretty interesting. And one of the things that's kind of nice about that is that to do this research, then maybe you don't need a wearable device. Okay, so to summarize, before I kind of wrap up talking about intervention work, wearables that assess one metric of autonomic arousal, that was skin conductance responses, improve our ability to predict how severe suicidal thoughts will be, but not whether or not people have suicidal thoughts. Wearables that assess sleep may be limited in what, if anything, they can tell us about suicide risk, but ultimately that may not be so much about the wearable, but might be a phenomenological thing that improves our understanding of sleep and suicide. It might be that something about the subjective experience of sleep is what kind of is telling us something about suicide risk. And ultimately, this is not something I shared. I'm just kind of sharing for the first time here. Wearables alone have basically no predictive ability for suicidal thinking later on. The worst performing model in that first study was a model I didn't show you. It was the model where we looked at wearables only. That model had almost no predictive ability. Now, of course, there's some shared method variance and so on. But ultimately, if you just have someone have a wearable device and be like, okay, this wearable device is going to tell us when they're suicidal, that is likely not going to happen with today's technology. Okay, so now we've talked about understanding, we've talked about prediction. Now let's talk a bit about suicide risk reduction interventions. So first, I've been on multiple soapboxes today. Allow me to get on one final soapbox, my philosophical perspective on technology and interventions for suicide risk. So we have a lot of suicide risk reduction interventions. They work well, but as is true for literally any intervention ever, it could work better. Technology can make treatments more effective by making them easier to use the moments they're needed. I don't believe that technology will replace the role of humans in therapy. So I'm not here to say that thanks to technology, our inpatient units will be staffed by iPhones, right? That is not something that is realistic. But certainly, using a smartphone app, even as a standalone psychotherapeutic intervention, is far better than nothing. There are lots of people who can't or won't access therapy. A smartphone app that gives them psychotherapeutic content in the moments they need it the most, that could make a really big impact on these people's lives. So again, I have this balanced perspective. Suicide risk reductions work well. They could certainly work better, true of any intervention for anything, right? Technology, specifically for suicide risk interventions, can make them easier to use the moments they're most needed. The reason I say that is because going back to that finding about suicidal thinking escalating quickly and being really distressing, that is a time where people's cognitive resources are depleted, right? When you're really distressed, it's hard to do something cognitively taxing. Some of the things that we do in psychotherapy are somewhat cognitively taxing. A smartphone app that makes the content more accessible at the moment that it's needed can go a long way to making that work less taxing and possibly more effective. So how do we make psychotherapeutic content more accessible? So like I said, very difficult to effectively use therapy skills in the midst of a distressing suicide crisis. Technology can help make that content more simple or easier to access. So we've done a series of studies, and we're currently doing a series of studies that looks basically like this. I like to design a study and then just stick with it because it's easier to write IRB protocols that way, apparently. And so a lot of the work that I'm going to describe here looks like this, where we had individual sessions or workshops conducted in person or via telehealth, and a smartphone app that delivers opportunities to practice therapy skills in everyday life. So what this means is we take traditional psychotherapy, usually in our studies, it's a brief psychotherapy, so think 3 to 4 brief sessions, and pair it with an app. And so what we're doing is we're taking regular clinical care and adding some novelty to it. In fact, as of like a few weeks from now, Rutgers is one of the largest mental health care providers actually in the country, certainly the biggest in New Jersey. What we're going to start doing is rolling out the psychotherapy component of our research studies as an actual clinical service. And so what that means is we've gone from research study to now implementing this one component while we add on to that using a smartphone app to see if that improves the treatment. So we've got a regular treatment, we've got a brief version that we think works pretty well, and we're adding an app to that. We're going to see what happens sort of system-wide. So what I'm showing you here, this is a result, this is a study that we did actually with the College Counseling Center in the middle of COVID. We've done this exact study with suicidal inpatients. This treatment is the thing that's going to be rolled out in our Rutgers behavioral healthcare system. In this study, what we did is we found that the intervention works. So what I mean by that is that when people who did a brief cognitive behavioral skills workshop, then had access to a mobile app, when they use the app and they practice the skills, right? So the mobile app let them practice the skills they learned in therapy. This app reduced negative affect, among other things, for about 65% of the participants. And that's really interesting, really exciting, right? So you might say, okay, well, wait, it only worked for 65% of the people. What about the other 35%? For those 35% of the people, I'm okay with it not working for them. There's a clear reason for this. We would not expect any intervention to work for literally every single person. Especially, this is a 90-minute workshop teaching 3 psychotherapy skills, and then an app that people use for a couple of weeks afterwards. I'm sure that works for a lot of people, 65% of which in this study. But for a lot of people, that's not enough, right? And so the reason why this is exciting is that it tells us not only is there a brief intervention that seems to be effective, but it also gives us a sense of for whom this intervention is not as effective as it could be. And for those people, what we're sort of doing now is offering a booster session. And then if the booster session doesn't work, our plan is to create a study, sort of a step care approach, where we give those people even more therapy. It helps with resource allocation and so on. So this is research where it doesn't work for everyone, but we're kind of excited because it's telling us something, that some people are not feeling the way they should, the way we would expect after practicing their therapy skills. So another set of things, so what I'm showing, the first thing I showed is kind of traditional cognitive behavioral therapy based off the unified protocol. What I'm showing here is a effort that has primarily been led by my close collaborator here, Shreen Rizvi, at taking dialectical behavior therapy content and making it more accessible to an incredibly wide audience. And so the study that I'm going to show here is testing whether her group's videos that are truly amazing. They teach dialectical behavior therapy skills. They have been translated into 6 or 7 languages at this point. And the goal of them is to distill the core concepts of DBT to anyone that has a couple of minutes to watch a YouTube video. Of course, not designed to replace full model DBT, but the skills of DBT can be useful for a variety of things, for a variety of people. And so this makes it more accessible. So in the study I'm going to show you here, this is another study we did with college students, but this can and will be applied to suicide reduction, risk reduction in more severe populations. We've got a couple of grants under review now that are trying to do this in primary care, which is a place where it's really easy to find people who are suicidal but may not go to a hospital. And the goal is to give these videos to those people and see if we can identify who needs more than the videos and who's okay with just that. So what I'm showing you here, dialectical behavior therapy is sort of mechanism driven. There's targets supposed to address. And one of those targets is making negative emotions more tolerable. So dialectical behavior therapy isn't about alleviating negative emotions, because we can't do that, right? Life has negative emotions, but rather about helping you tolerate them more and respond to them in a more adaptive way. And so we had an intervention group and a control group, pre-post, basically the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after getting access to this content and doing EMA. And what we saw is the intervention group did not get better. The intervention group did not rate emotions as any more bearable. That seems kind of problematic, right? What we found is that the control group got worse. Now, why would that happen, right? And so when we find this, it's confusing because in one way, this could support our hypothesis. The intervention group at least didn't get worse, but we need a good reason for it. And thankfully, there is a very good reason. So this study was done where we had to, because there was this like weird internal funding mechanism that created this like really weird pace. We had to do things incredibly quickly. And so we had to get everyone enrolled in like the first 2 weeks of the semester. So we had the entire sample enrolled in the first 2 weeks of the semester. If you remember what the first 2 weeks of the semester are like, they're a lot calmer than the rest of the semester. Oh, by the way, this is also during COVID, like the really bad semester of COVID. And so what we found was that throughout the semester, people who had these skills, they didn't get any better. Like it didn't like make it as if they were not dealing with a distressing situation, but rather it prevented them from getting worse because they were equipped with skills that helped them handle the impending stress of the middle of a semester in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so not only does it sort of support the intervention, it's a really good reminder to have a control group and another good reminder to address risk among college students. And so one sort of funding challenge we often face, at least here with like the National Institutes of Health, is that college student research is somewhat hard to get funded sometimes because there's this sort of stigma attached to it. that college student research is just convenient sampling and we're doing research on it because it's easy to. And sure, if you work at a college, it's somewhat easy to get access to college students. But it's really important, and all of you probably know this just as well as I do, working with students. College students need help, right? This is a difficult time to be an emerging adult. And I think we are way underestimating how much research and how much work needs to be done to improve the mental health of our college students. And so this is any kind of small example of that. So to summarize here, the optimistic parts. Technology lets us understand suicidal thinking in ways not possible before. And it helps us make interventions more effective and extend them to those who can't or won't access them. Less optimistic parts, some technology, especially wearables, are high effort, they're expensive, and at this point may not provide much information about suicide risk. It doesn't mean they won't in the future, but at this point now, they are really developmental and we still need a lot more research to use wearable devices in a way that helps us better understand suicide risk. All right, that's all I have, and we've got like a couple of extra minutes to spare. I have either timed that well or talked way too fast. So yeah, I guess we've got time for questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. The screen changes. Yeah, one element really missing from these Zoom things is actual applause. And I actually started to look for my reaction that would allow me to applaud through Zoom. Still can't
I
find
appreciate the applause reactions.
Oh, there it is. I found it. It's very different because in person I can applaud on command. It's just Zoom that makes it complicated.
That's it. And you don't have to like, class. That's nice. Yeah. Well, thank you all.
So the way we can handle questions and question and answer session is if you have questions, you can either put your name in the chat to be called on, or you can type out your question. I will note that I have 7 questions, but I'm not expecting to get to all of it. So I'll give people a chance to think, and I will jump in with my own if I'm able to have that privilege.
Sounds great.
All right, one question, and God, if I'm missing something, I apologize. Hopefully someone will tell me. One question I have involves so one of the first studies you talked about how you were able to look at many aspects of suicidal desire. So your EMA approach allowed you to look at the baselines, the peaks, frequency of peaks. I was curious if you had any thoughts on or data on which aspects of that track most closely with the standard kind of questionnaire we use. Obviously those questionnaires have limitations, and that's part of what you're pointing out, that questionnaires that we typically use will pull for some version of an aggregate feeling. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And then I found myself wondering, well, what is it pulling for? What will motivate people's responses to that? Maybe it's the peak because it's, when you experience that, it's so salient, or maybe it's number of peaks, or maybe somehow it really is just the average. So I thought you might have more insight on that than perhaps anyone else.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so, sort of the heart of it is when we ask someone, how suicidal have you been over the past month? We know it's not one value unless it's 0, right? And so for those individuals, what are they drawing from? Like, how are they answering it? And I don't know if we have a great answer. My guess would be it's some combination of the highest peak and the general average. And that's sort of more of in my mind, kind of a cognitive thing of like, are they relying upon this representative, like worst peak, maybe some average, or, and this is something I think is kind of common with these measures, how they feel at the moment, and either some anchoring and adjustment or literally how they're feeling. And it's tough, we have not yet compared like what aspects are correlated with the retrospective reports. What we're doing now is we have daily and weekly assessments of suicidal thinking. And that's some of what we're actually planning on doing to see which aspects of a retrospective report map on best to a momentary report.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. Luke, go ahead and jump in.
Hey, Evan. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thanks so much. I'm putting my kind of psychophysiology hat on, and your conclusion that the addition of the wearables beyond the affect EMA didn't, dramatically improve your signal. Of course, there you were looking at skin conductance only, and skin conductance, yeah, it's a very noisy measure, as you said, but it's also a sympathetic measure. So in terms of theories that talk about, the role of parasympathetic in like buffering and how that could be important in emotion regulation, do you think there's mileage there? And I suppose what I'm really interested in is how close is wearable tech to being able to give researchers parasympathetic signals?
Yeah, so I, admittedly don't have a good understanding of any of this, no, of sort of what is being done now. And the difficulty with a lot of this, just kind of to broadly answer the question about like able to better capture the wider range of physiological responses. It's hard to know because these are commercial devices. And so when you see like what's in the pipeline of wearable devices, whether it be new sensors or new algorithms, the answer is always the most optimistic version. And so it's always a little bit hard to distill. Now, with that said, I think kind of what you're getting at too, is that we used kind of a prepackaged algorithm as opposed to looking at the raw skin conductance side, which at least would give you a sense of recovery, right? And so we didn't look at that. We also didn't look at the time after the skin conductance response to get a sense of sort of what's going on afterwards, the prolonged nature of it. So the answer is sort of, I think there's a lot of utility there. I don't know the realistic timeline of being able to get better signals, right? So a better sense of heart rate, respiration. There are some things that can do that. And sort of, I think we need that to get a better sense of the entire timeline of what's going on. Question.
All right, we'll go to Veronica next.
Hi, it's actually a good sequence because I would also like to ask about wearables, and thank you for the great presentation, very interesting work. I am, and it's more of a comment than of a question, sorry about that, but I'm working with wearables and chronic pain, and the one comment is about the sleep analysis you did with wearables as opposed to self-reported sleep. Now, working with chronic pain is a great opportunity to see sleep disturbances because they're very prevalent in chronic pain. So by the data of wearable devices, we're not seeing any differences of any objective sleep metrics between chronic pain and control group, which to me tells that wrist-based wearable devices are just not good at measuring sleep, right? And yeah, so if you have a comment to that.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the validity of the device, right? And so if you have a group that is having sleep disturbances, especially ones that are like physically noticeable, right? Like waking up, moving around, tossing and turning, you would expect something. So it's sort of what is that, like an ecological validity concern. And the issue, as I would understand it, is these devices are known to be decently reliable on the studies that have been done, right? And my understanding is a lot of the validation studies are gold standard sleep studies where you're looking more at construct or conversion validity, as opposed to in the real world, there's a group of people that are having sleep disturbances and you're not seeing those differences. And I feel like that speaks to either a limitation in what these can measure, at the best, or to the worst, these don't measure this thing at all. They're measuring something different, hopefully reliably, but it's not what they say it is. And it's just a challenge I think we're slowly recognizing, but consumer interests kind of work against us, which is a new and difficult thing I think we're facing in psychology. How to read websites and know that like these devices aren't all they're cracked up to be sometimes.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. For wearables, actually, the reliability is more of an issue than validity, because it's one thing to validate it at the lab and then people take it home and do all the things that they do. Like you're saying, you're putting the Apple Watch on the table. How does Apple Watch know that it's not on your hand? And I know that some devices do have a hard time distinguishing even that. So it's, and I'll be happy to talk more if you like, but totally offline, because I don't think it's of interest for most people. But thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to invite a question from ITAV Mobile Card A10.
I was hoping ITAV Mobile Card A10 would ask a question.
But can it be done? Well, we can. I have the power to unmute them, but if they're actually not ready, I don't want to do that. You're either muted or not aware that you're being asked to ask your question. But why don't we go to David, and we'll come back to you, ITAV Mobile Card A10.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Kleiman. That was such an exciting talk. I'm one of David Klonsky's students, so yeah, this is my area of interest directly too. Yeah. Oh, I think ITAV. I'll duck out.
Oh, did that work?
It did work. There's an echo effect at the moment.
Did that work? Can you hear me?
Well, why don't you go ahead and try? So,
No.
you can always go ahead and type the question. So while that's troubleshooted, David, why don't you hop back on?
Okay. Yeah, my question was about your opinion on the ideal frequency for EMA with balancing out the kind of demands from asking more frequently and then the additional information from it, and whether your opinion on that varies a fair amount based on the research question, or if it's relatively consistent what you think it should be.
Yeah, good question. And that is sort of an empirical question. It's something we've been trying to struggle with, because when we do an EMA study and say we ask all the questions 3 times a day, what we've done implicitly is we've said all of these things vary at the same rate. We're interested in them 3 times a day. They vary that, and maybe not any more, any less. And so what we're interested in finding out is what is sort of the optimal sampling frequency for all of these variables. And so, that's important because think about reducing burden. And so if hopelessness varies every 6 hours on average and sadness varies every 3 hours on average, obviously it's not that straightforward, but say it were, that would tell us we only need to ask about hopelessness every other survey, right? And so that kind of stuff would be really useful. We've done some work so far. It's stuff we sort of just started looking at, the variability between versus within person at different time scales, basically removing responses. So looking at suicidal thinking 6 times a day, 3 times a day, and once per day. And what we actually find is you don't lose much up until about once per day. And so a lot of these things, if they're not varying that frequently, you don't need to ask them that often. Now, of course, when in doubt, you ask them more often, because then you're at least capturing this thing, but of course you're increasing burden. And so at this point, I don't know if there is an optimal sampling frequency. Like, we don't yet know in the literature, but certainly there probably is a way to figure it out if one exists. And to kind of figure out, from that information, at certain times, like when people are acutely suicidal, do you sample more frequently or not? Those are sort of the questions we're kind of playing with. So it's a good question.
All right, now there's a message about room 4001 being back. I don't know if that refers to whatever is appearing as ITAV Mobile Card A10. So, okay, go for it.
All right. Hi, folks. We are 7 people and 1 dog who have gathered to watch your colloquium, and I think it's awesome. I hope you're not getting too much feedback here. Yeah, thank you for your talk. I just thought it was really scientific, but also clinically relevant, and I learned a lot. So one of the things that I learned that I just thought was really cool was first, the finding that suicidality seems to go up and down, like even in a period of a couple hours during the same day. And that, just the appreciation that it can be, if self-report is just so valuable here over certain things like wearable devices, then it can just be really hard to get people self-report about their suicidality, like right at the moment that they are most suicidal, if we're thinking that that's the best place to intervene. Mm-hmm. So this leads me to my question. Really exciting. Where I kind of got to, though, in terms of the takeaway message, was like, okay, what does this mean? Does this indicate that the types of interventions that are more like universal interventions could be really useful here. If there's just a lot of variability going on in somebody's suicide risk in a short moment, and it's hard to get them to tell you when they're really suicidal. So what I mean by universal interventions is, does this call for the types of public awareness campaigns that people do, or, putting up guardrails on bridges or the helpline phones in common places where people would be considering making an attempt, or just like supports for, I think about like, universal childcare. Could that just be a type of support that would generally support people and families to make them happier and their kids happier? And, is it, or getting rid of poverty? Like, isn't this, are these things that are more meaningful interventions for suicide risk, given how hard it is to predict those moment to moment things on the individual level? So I recognize there's all sorts of ways to intervene. We need multiple ways. So I was just curious to hear any thoughts you might have about how some of those universal interventions might be integrated with your work or other ways of thinking about how to intervene.
Yeah, that is a really good question and sort of set of ideas. And, I think at the heart of it is that if it's really hard to identify these states where people are acutely suicidal and they're not occurring that frequently, then interventions that are designed just for that are probably not going to do much. Right now, if there are interventions for that period of time, the way I like to think of them and the way they're kind of usually framed is that those are interventions that are useful to kind of get you out of that situation, keep you alive, but not do much to, improve things in the future. So when I think about the interventions, and I didn't get a lot into the content of the interventions, but all of the ones that we tend to use, so some have been dialectical behavior therapy, others have been the unified protocol. Both of them are somewhat transdiagnostic. The unified protocol is explicitly transdiagnostic. And so what that means is that we're designing this intervention that works in times even when people are not acutely suicidal. So if we are trying to deliver people an intervention when they're really suicidal and we miss, right, they're not suicidal, these interventions are helpful when people are distressed, when they're agitated, when they're sad. And the reason that's useful is because if we're giving an intervention to someone at the wrong time, it's probably not like when they're feeling really happy. It just happens to be they're not suicidal, but they're still feeling pretty crummy. And so the interventions that we do are meant to be more transdiagnostic and not rely on the assumption that people are using them exclusively when they're suicidal. Now, the broader thing, right, about kind of the more primary prevention, getting things out into the world, we've done some work with that. And, this is something public health is incredibly interested in. The issue often tends to be, is there a wide scale approach that we just give everyone, like learning, like what are the signs of suicide risk? What could you do to someone or say to someone who's suicidal? That kind of messaging is really great. I think public health has done some work towards that. The problem then comes of, trying to identify people who are suicidal or might be suicidal. That's where the real resistance comes, where we get primary care providers to screen for suicide risk, but they don't know what to do. And so they just don't screen or just don't report. And so there's a very clear, public health, public policy aspect to this that, if anything, I think just reflects the importance of doing interdisciplinary work. And a lot of the work that my lab's doing now is in pretty close collaboration. And a lot of the work actually Rutgers is doing. We kind of have a lot of suicide researchers, and we're working on getting things more synergized, is with public health, and kind of working on dissemination of psychoeducation, intervention, and so on. I think kind of gets to your point there, just wider scale prevention. Hopefully I got a good answer in there somewhere. That's a whole lot.
And I think Connor Kearns has another question from the same Zoom window.
Kill the volume of it. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. My question was, I feel like in therapy, oftentimes the first step is increasing monitoring, so increasing self-awareness. And I'm wondering what the impact of all this self-monitoring is on people's suicidal thinking, and if you've been able to look at that at all. So just becoming more aware of the huge variability. In this moment, I felt very suicidal. 4 hours later, I felt much better. Does that change the trajectory over time? And similarly, becoming acutely aware of the fact that I've been highly suicidal all day today, does that have a magnifying effect or defeating effect on the individual. So what's the impact of all this monitoring kind of over time on the individuals?
Yeah, okay. So that is a question that we've struggled with for quite some time. Primarily or initially a struggle forced upon us by IRBs who needed some education. Right, so kind of the first question was, is there like an iatrogenic effect? So if we ask people about suicidal thinking, are they gonna become suicidal? And so there's been research that's been done. We've done some studies too. There does not appear to be an iatrogenic effect. There's not like a reactive effect where people report suicide risk and then all of a sudden they feel more distressed. Obviously, we've had some people in studies tell us that, but out of nearly 1,000 EMA participants, a small handful have, and we would expect that, right? So, okay, those are the negative ones. We can kind of not worry so much about them. So now, but what about the positive things? We get a lot of participants anecdotally telling us they enjoy reporting their suicidal thinking because it helps them monitor it. It's really interesting to us because we sort of go out of our way to make it clear that this is not an intervention study, and then we don't give them their data back at this point, something we're thinking about doing in the future. So participants know this, right? Because they don't see their data after they submit it, but it's really interesting. We've done a couple of, as you do at the end of studies, that kind of qualitative things where you ask people about the study itself. And a decent amount of people say they like being able to check in and report. And so now, just because people like it, it's unclear what effect it might have, perhaps just on better understanding of their patterns of suicidal thinking. Whether it reduces suicidal thinking in and of itself, probably not. But what I think is that there's certainly room there for intervention where people like reporting on suicidal thinking. It makes them somehow feel better checking in, which of course makes sense. And one thing we're thinking about doing in the future is capitalizing on that and designing intervention. We're not just giving data back to participants, but help them kind of understand, like, when do you feel more suicidal and how can you change those times and change your settings. And so long story short is not iatrogenic, promising that people like reporting on suicidal thinking, and I think a clear spot for capitalizing for interventions in the future.
I think I see an opportunity to ask a question, and I actually have two questions I want to ask, but they're related. So I'm going to say that I have one question with two parts. The first is very basic, but I'm intensely curious. So your work is doing just a superb job capturing the fact that suicidal desire ebbs and flows over short time periods. What I'm genuinely curious about is, does it ebb and flow in a manner that is more stable, less stable, or about the same as regular moods or like regular emotions? Things like feeling, sad or happy or anxious. Is it basically about the same, or is there any evidence that it's a little bit more stable, or maybe even the opposite, that it's somehow less stable?
Yeah. Okay. So I am biased by saying very good idea because it's something we're actually just about to do. Where, so the initial study that I showed you in the follow-up one were both kind of small, so total of like 70 participants across the two samples. So it wasn't enough for us to do any of these more interesting questions. Like, we didn't want to add any more indicators than kind of what we already had. Not one thing, of the many things sticking out to us after doing the study, one of which is like, are we capturing something unique to suicidal thinking, or are we capturing this thing that we know about, right? Like volatility of emotions, reactivity of emotions. And so that is something we're planning on doing now that we have a much larger sample, so something closer to about 500 than about 75. And what we want to see is sort of what other information tells us more about these subgroups. So one of the things we're planning on doing is including affect in there as well. So are we just mapping these ebbs and flows? Like, are there a group of people who have perhaps a discrepancy? I think sort of that's what you're describing here, of people whose affect does not track with suicidal thinking. So people whose suicidal thinking looks a lot like this, but their affect might be a little more stable. That group, if it exists, would be really interesting, because then that might tell us something about how our typical interventions for reducing volatility related to emotions and tolerance to negative emotions might not be so effective, because they're maybe tolerating negative emotions just fine, but not becoming suicidal as a result of it. So that's something that we haven't done yet, but we're planning to. We have the data, so like next couple of weeks, but it is something that's kind of important for us to figure out, of like, what exactly did we measure here? And is it suicidal thinking? Is it affect? Is it both? And so on.
I think you answered a more sophisticated question than I was even asking. I mean, believe me, I have high interest in what you just said, and like in very specific ways for specific reasons. But I'm also interested in even sort of like more backing up kind of thing, which is like, let's say you just had the trajectories of sad, anxious, happy, and suicidal desire.
Yeah.
But you didn't know which is which. Would suicidal desires stand out as different from other typical affect states? Does it vary just as much, or because one reason I ask is because I do think that some people have a bias, even if it's implicit, to view suicidality as something that people carry around in them in some sort of stable way. I think that's the implicit belief behind a lot of the people who believe that prediction someday is going to get great, because there's just something in people that we just have to detect, and not realizing that it's like saying there's sadness that's in people that we have to detect. And it depends what's happening in someone's life. It depends what they're focused on. And I think so that makes me think suicidal desire might very well just behave like any other kind of emotion state, or whatever that would mean. But you probably have more data on that than anyone else. So
yeah. So, and what I can say is that when we think about like descriptives like mean, ICC, RMSSD, basically like average score, how much variability is from person to person versus observation, and how like jagged the lines are when we plot them. Yeah, it's basically, with one exception I'll get to in a second, looks almost exactly the same as affect. And so similar RMSSD, similar ICC, the average differs in that people tend to, even in more severe studies, right, or more severe populations, the average negative emotion rating is usually higher than the average suicidal thinking rating. Now, we're not exactly comparing the same thing, but ultimately the ebbs and flows look very, very similar. Now, what we don't know is, are the ebbs and flows correlated? All we know is that they both vary like kind of around the same amount. And so when I think of suicidal thinking, I understand it more as an affect state than something people are just stuck in. Now, there are plenty of people who reported pretty similar scores all the time, but that is not the majority of the sample. These are acutely suicidal individuals. And the other thing kind of I'll underscore, much like affect, every single person in all the studies we've done has reported a period of time, a few observations even, where they reported a 0 out of 10 on all of the suicidal thinking variables in a way where they weren't just putting zeros. Like every single person, even those who are acutely suicidal, had periods of time they weren't suicidal. And that's the same thing. People are depressed at periods of time when they're not depressed. And so I really do think, at least the way we measured, it functions a lot like an affect state instead of this thing you're just in for weeks or months.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful and super interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
My one follow-up, which is really just the same question, except that it's not, but it's related to the ebbing and flowing piece. And that is, my own belief, and I'm going to say this in a very simple kind of statement. There's many versions and more sort of depths that could be said about this statement, and even different ways to view it. But is that, basically suicide attempts occur at peaks of suicidal desire if suicide capability is present. And so, part of me just felt when you showed those 2018 data with the different groups is that, the group that had the most recent suicide attempt is just the group that's most likely to have the highest or the most peaks. And when I think about some older research that people don't really pay attention to anymore, I think there was, I don't have the best memory, I think there was a study by Joiner's group where they found that worst point suicidal desire predicted future attempts more than current suicidal desire. And there was another study, I can't remember if it's the same group or different, where they found that variability of suicidal desire was the best predictor of future attempts. And I really just saw variability as a proxy for peaks, because you can't have peaks without variability. And so I was wondering if really the converging perspective is just simply that it's the peaks of suicidal desire that matter most, because people don't tend to make attempts at moderate desire. It really is about the peaks, which also I think fits some of what you're saying. It fits some of the implications for how intervention should work, whether it's to detect the peaks and have something then, or to take some of these more sort of universal approaches or have safety plans that are in place. So when the peaks occur, to have warning signs in place, to have, so when the peaks occur that can't be anticipated. So anyway, I was wondering if maybe just you're capturing just in that study another version of it's the peaks that matter for attempts.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. There's a version of the way I explained this stuff back when I had less stuff to build on it that I talk about where I show this EMA work it certainly tells a lot of stuff, but yeah, so the, Tracy Whitty's work, which I think is the worst point paper from Joiner's group, right? Tells us something very similar to what we see with the EMA, if that's the part, right? Where it's like, it's the peak. So if we just know about someone's peak, that tells us their risk for suicide, right? And so in that regard, I say, yeah, right, there's a lot of overlap there. The only thing EMA adds is perhaps some more accuracy, and that reporting in the moment as opposed to retrospectively reporting. Now, that right, accuracy is always important, but what it also says is that we can, and I've sort of said this the whole time I've been doing EMA, maybe it's self-handicapping, maybe it's just recognizing like it is what it is, that accuracy is important, but ultimately, if we never had EMA, we would still be able to learn a lot of things we've learned, just in maybe a different, little bit harder to assess way, right? And so asking people about their worst point, if it was a really obvious worst point, people might remember it, but with EMA, we can kind of track it. Now, what we don't know, of course, is if someone retrospects on their worst point, does that map onto their EMA response of their worst point? That'd be pretty interesting. And what that might tell us is, yeah, no, this is where someone would attempt suicide. Now, the thing, of course, and you and I've talked about, so I know, this too is an important thing to like reflect on, is that someone's worst point may not even relate to a suicide attempt, because no one in the studies that I showed you attempted suicide during the EMA period. We have new data where people have, but even their worst points didn't always relate to a suicide attempt. And so what it probably is a worst point of suicidal thinking plus any multitude of other things, or times a multitude of other things. And I think that's the other important part, that EMA is great, but like any self-report method, you can only learn about the things that you're assessing. And if we are not assessing the right things and not taking time to learn what else we should assess, we could still miss it. So sort of my long answer to your well-worded question, my much longer answer, but hopefully there's some stuff there that's useful.
Yeah, well, my question was not particularly well worded, but I very much appreciate the answer. This is certainly one of my favorite talks for a long, long time. I'll just see at this point we're heading towards the end of our time anyway, but I'll just see if anyone else wants to jump in with any other questions before I, yeah, go ahead, Isaac.
Hey there, thanks for the great talk. I was just wondering about EMA. I use EMA for some of my research with Professor Handy here at UBC from more general cognitive and mood perspective. But I was actually curious, from a cultural perspective, do you think that this kind of work can speak to cross-cultural considerations, like how some cultures suicide is taboo and it's maybe less obvious in its presentation, or people may not even want to share that? So I was just curious what you could say to that.
Yeah, good question. It broke up a little bit. I don't know if it was my connection, but I think I got the bulk of the question there. So I'll answer the question I think was asked, and you can let me know if it wasn't. And so, with EMA, and this is not necessarily the thing about any individual culture, but rather just the point that talking about and reporting about suicide is difficult. And that fact, it is true across a large number of groups, but certainly there are individuals who come from backgrounds where reporting suicidal thinking is either frowned upon, diminished, right? So we have a group there. We have another group, of individuals who may, and rightfully so, unfortunately, fear the consequences of reporting their suicidal thinking. And so to a certain extent, there may be no method that corrects that, but certainly self-report methods make it easier to answer these questions because of the discrete nature of them. When we design our smartphone questions, they don't look any different than other apps you would be using. It lets people discreetly answer about affect states, about mood, and so on, in a way that hopefully diminishes some stigma and some barriers. The final thing I'll say about that, I've noticed, and this is something I've noticed, especially with the undergrads that we teach and that we work with, whatever messaging has gone on about mental health in general, I feel like it's been really successful. And I've found, been teaching now for more than a decade, and I've noticed just the openness of college student and high school students for sharing how mental health, that's suicide. And I think that translates to to hopefully just a lower stigma about reporting mental health concerns, whether it be in a survey, whether it be to friends, to family, and so on. And I hope that is a trend that continues. Of course, with that said, there are a lot of people who are motivated to disclose their suicidal thinking, some of whom for real good reason. Others, possibly less of it. It's stuff we've done too, is kind of figuring out when and which people are more likely to conceal than others, and how to make them more likely to feel comfortable sharing if doing so is appropriate. Good question. Hopefully you were there for the answer. I know you're listening, may have dropped off.
Yeah, I noticed he's still there, but got somehow demoted to the second on the Zoom call. And we have a text reply too.
Oh, there we go. I'm glad you asked the question. Yes, I appreciate the optimism as well.
I'll give you the option, Evan, if you want one more question, or if now's a good time to wrap up, especially given that your day is far from over and it's late where you are.
I am happy to take another question if so. Otherwise, yeah, I'll defer to whoever has the questions.
All right. This is your fault, not mine. In one of your studies, you focused on the unbearability of sort of the negative. And one thing that we're finding in my lab, and Michaela, who I think is here, is in one of the joint funny named Zoom rooms, published a paper with me where we basically found that just 3 items that ask about unbearable pain as opposed to psychological pain in general. And we find this in multiple other studies too, as powerful correlations with suicidal ideation. I mean, we're not talking 0.3s, 0.4s, we're getting up to 0.6s, and it's just 3 items, which is supposed to be too unreliable to measure anything. And longer measures of pain don't do any better. In other words, the items that are not about the unbearable pain don't seem to be doing anything except just sort of hanging out with the items that matter. This has led us to wonder in the lab what makes pain or certain kinds of pain unbearable. Is it certain kinds of negative emotion? Is it like the sheer intensity? Is it negative emotion or negative, make it be physical pain too, combined with low self-efficacy? Is it negative emotion combined with hopelessness that it can get better? And we have some ideas. We have some ideas for how to study this, but we don't know the answer. And because this is also something you focused on, I just thought I would see if you happen to have thoughts on it.
Yeah, that is a really, I don't know if I have a great answer of what makes certain emotions unbearable, certain experiences unbearable. And I feel like it's almost idiographic sort of question where we have an individual and wanting to find out for that person what makes certain affect states unbearable or experiences unbearable, and is that consistent? I think that would be my big question too. Like, are there certain people who really can't tolerate feeling uncertain, feeling agitated, and people who can, or is it more of a self-regulatory thing that when people are well rested and not stressed, they can tolerate a certain level of distress they couldn't tolerate other times? And that sort of speak to, that's the phenomenology of what it looks like as people lead up to suicide risk and what they do to escape aversive affect stage, which is sort of the unbearability of emotions. Often makes me think about the sort of escape theories of suicide. And that's kind of where that taps into there. Good question.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much for your talk and your, super thoughtful, balanced, sort of strategic, considered approach to this topic.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to have you. Sorry, just checking out the chat. So once again, I'm going to take the time to find my applause button. Really grateful. And for those who are still here, Dr. Kleiman actually still has one more meeting with us. So he really has spent the day with us. So thank you for that as well.
Of course. Thank you all. It's been a good game of talk. And I look forward to meeting with the students about an hour and a half. So thank you.